Yeah. I mean, I don't need it. It's
Okay.
just.
No, it looks fine though. I mean, it looks fine. But I know what you're saying. You just wanted to just have the presentation.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure. Click share your screen again. Let me see. Because it should on Google Slides. It should just do it. Share it one more time, and then go back to where it was before when it was just before. Okay, then do present from beginning.
Yeah,
There.
but yeah,
But you
that
want to do the
doesn't
notes.
do. Yeah, you see how it brings it back out.
Yeah, so it's like when you click, whenever you need to look at the, yeah. So if you want to do it that way, you wouldn't be able to see the notes at the bottom.
What do you see? You still see the bar on top, right?
At first, it had went away just right now.
Because I didn't add the notes. Like I
Yeah.
didn't put the notes up. If you think this is fine, that's
Yeah, it
fine.
was fine. Yeah, it was fine.
Okay.
I'm gonna bring the people in. Huh?
Okay. Don't forget to mute yourself, Daddy. After. Hi, everybody. We're gonna get started in like 2 minutes. We're gonna give people a little bit more time to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, I see more people are coming in, so we'll get started in a few seconds. So just a few ground rules before we get started. If you guys can just keep your audio muted, and then if you have any questions, I know we gave everyone the opportunity to send in your questions, but if you do have any questions during the presentation, you can just drop them in the chat box. And if any of your questions aren't answered during the presentation, then we will we'll be just drop it in the chat, and we'll be sure to answer it before the session is over. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. We have Dr. Odealys Pollard from Rockefeller University. She's going to be talking to us today about COVID-19 and vaccinations. I know there's been a lot of questions as to whether you want to get vaccinated. And we wanted to have the opportunity for you guys to get some more information about the vaccination and COVID, so that way you can make an informed decision about it. So I'm going to allow Dr. Pollard to introduce herself and give you guys a little bit of background about her, and then she's going to go into her presentation and go ahead and take the floor.
Hey, Melissa. Hi, everyone. So like she mentioned, my name is Dr. Odealys Pollard. I'm actually originally from the U.S. Virgin Islands, so there might be an accent peeking through when I get a little bit passionate about the subject. So I went to the University of the Virgin Islands, completed my biology degree. Bachelor's of Science in Biology degree. I then moved to the US mainland, spent 2 years working in a lab at the University of Rochester. So I did research on HIV vaccine development as well as flu vaccine development. I then went on to pursue my PhD in microbiology and immunology at New York Medical College in Westchester, New York. And there I studied how a parasite pretty much hides away from the immune system. So we did a lot of work on figuring out the immune system response to some of these microbes. While I was in graduate school, I did a lot of teaching. So I've taught college for a few years. I went into college teaching full-time after graduating. And then I went into science outreach in 2016. So I'm currently at the Rockefeller University. So my role there is pretty much trying to communicate the science in a way that's digestible for a large audience. Specifically, our program deals with K-12, so I'm very passionate on STEM education. I do a lot of mentorship and managing program for high school students in New York City area. And I also engage with scientists and teachers and students just to kind of spark their interest in STEM. I think a lot of the issues we see now is because people kind of like brushed science aside in school, and I get it because if you don't have like a passionate teacher teaching the subject, a lot of that information tends to kind of like go in the back of your head. So I'll do a brief presentation on your immune system, COVID-19, vaccinations, giving you a little bit of the science, but in a way that I hope you can understand. If there are any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, like Melissa said. If you want to raise your hand, there's a raise your hand option. If you're like confused about something, feel free to do that, and I can you can unmute yourself and ask those questions. All right, so let's get started. So I quickly want to go over what the immune system is. So we hear all these talks about like the immune system and being sick and recovering from illness. And I just want to point out that the immune system is something that's very complex. It's taken scientists many years to figure out how it actually works, the cells that are involved, and ways that we can learn about the immune system so we can prevent illness in the future. And so one fun fact, at Rockefeller University, one of the scientists that used to work there won the Nobel Prize in his work on HCV, which is hepatitis C virus. We have scientists that won a Nobel Prize in understanding how DNA and genetic information work, which I'm going to talk about in this slide. But your immune system pretty much protects you from disease. It actually prevents or limits your infection. It can fight germs or foreign substances. And I know we think about like our red blood cells as like the main component in our bloods, but we actually have what we call white blood cells. And even though they are comprise pretty much about 1% of what's in your blood, they are very important players in your immune system, and they're what we need in order to fight off the infection once it bypass your outside barrier. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I found this really cool figure just to show you like what these things look like under a microscope. I think like visualization really sets the tone for people understanding what occurs. So these are neutrophils in red. And then in red, there's a site of injury, and then there these other cells that are being recruited by the spot of injury. And so you'll see that they recognize that something's going wrong in the body, and they swarm to that area and they recruit other cells to come by. Yeah, so the neutrophils are in red. They're all going to the site, and then the green are some other immune cells that they're recruiting. So there's a lot of crosstalk that's happening. It's not just a stagnant thing, but they do a really, really great job of signaling to the rest of the body like, hey, something's wrong. Bring all your friends, bring all the weapons so we can try and get rid or fix the problem that's happening in the body. And so when we think about the immune system, people usually think of it in terms of infection. So in order for us to combat infection, there are different ways that our body do that. And so one part of the immune system is what we call the innate immune response. So this is something that happens right away. It's the initial line of defense. And we usually think of this as your physical barrier. So thinking about your skin, right? So if you touch bacteria on your skin, it usually won't penetrate your skin unless you get a cut. When we think about the saliva in our mouth, there are enzymes or things that can break down or get rid of, foreign pathogens or bacteria. When you think about your stomach acid, so like the stomach acid in your body actually helps to get rid of harmful things that you may have eaten. And so those are some of the initial ways that our body prevents that from going any deeper. If you do encounter a pathogen inside your body, so there's a breach in that physical barrier, so you got a cut, and so you have a staph infection or something, they're usually a set of cells that run to that area really quickly to figure out how to fix it and how to get rid of it. And so we call these phagocytes or eating cells and natural killer cells. So the neutrophils that I showed in that previous picture are part of that group. And so with those two combined together, we can say that we can get rid of that infection. But there's a second part in the immune system, and I think it's more important for what I'm talking about today, and it's what we call our adaptive immune response. So this is something that actually tells your body, hey, there's something that's happening that's breached the system, or breached the capital. I don't know why that came into my head, but it's breached the capital, right? And we need to bring in the big soldiers to make sure that, one, we recognize these folks so the next time they come about that they don't enter. All right, so we're bringing in like the National Guard, we're bringing in all the military folks because the cops did their job, but they weren't as successful. So we think of these as T cells, which helps to fight that infection that has breached your body. And we also think about B cells. Now, B cells are, I think, the important players when we think about vaccine and having a lasting infection. Or lasting immunity to an infection. And so what these B cells do, they produce these molecules, these proteins called antibodies. And these antibodies are what recognizes if something comes in again. So like we mentioned, we know what these breachers look like. So we send a warning poster to your body. Your body recognizes it, keeps it in your head. So your B cells make these things and they're like, we know what this person looks like. They breached the first time. We want to make sure that we catch them before they cause any more damage. And that's what we think about when we talk about our adaptive immunity or our antibodies. And so our antibodies are just there floating around your body, just waiting for them to breach your body again. And so if you think about the chickenpox, so I guess in my day or anyone older than me, before the chickenpox vaccine, you usually get chickenpox once, you don't get it twice. And that's usually because your body recognizes it. It called your B cells over, you made these proteins that the next time your body sees that chickenpox coming in, it can quickly go in, capture it, and get rid of it. So really, really neat system. And also like these two responses work hand in hand. There's not just one thing playing a role at any specific point. And so, especially being from the islands, people always talk about like, what can I do to help build my immune system? And there are things that you can do to make sure that you live a healthy lifestyle and your immune cells are working at the best that they can. So doing simple things, like a diet high in fruits and vegetables, maintaining a healthy weight, a lot easier said than done. It's just a hassle to like work out a couple times a week, exercising regularly, good hygiene. Like I mentioned, you have that physical barrier. And so washing your hands with soap and water, like we know is a preventative measure for catching COVID. What happens is that soap actually breaks apart that virus that I'll talk about in a little bit so that it's not able to infect your cells. And then like if you take your finger and put it in your mouth, you're now introducing that foreign agent into your body. Getting enough sleep, also easier said than done, but we know that when your body doesn't have time to regenerate and recuperate and go back to square one, it has a harder time of fighting off infections when the time comes around. And little things like cooking your meats properly, washing your fruits and vegetables to avoid like E. coli contamination. We've heard of like Chipotle having like a romaine lettuce contamination. Just making sure you're cooking things thoroughly, you're washing them thoroughly before you eat. And of course, vaccination. So we know that vaccination has been a thing for a while. When we think about the lifespan back in like the 1800s versus the lifespan now, before we had all the scientific interventions, the lifespan was about 35, 40 max. Now we're living almost double that, right? And we can thank that because of vaccinations. And even if you do all of the others and not get vaccinated, we have to understand that there are differences between everyone. And remember, I told you that your immune system is complex. So there's not like a one for all. There are like components that happens in your genes that may not work in terms of making sure your immune system is working at the best that it can. All right, so before we get into like what the vaccine is, what a virus is, I think it's important for us to think about the basics. And basics when I talk about like DNA, RNA, protein. And you may have heard of this in school. I know a lot of people are hearing about these terms now with the COVID vaccine because of the new technology. And so I just want to go through step by step exactly what that means. So we know that us as humans and all living things actually have a genetic material called DNA, right? And that DNA is super important. It's what makes us, right? The color that you see on our skin, the eye color, our hair color, not my hair color, this is dyed, but like our natural hair color, right? Our height, you know, what ailments we have, things like sickle cell anemia, and other genetic ailments are all come about because of your DNA. Now, that DNA is super important. So if you look at a human cell or a eukaryotic cell, so something that's a living thing with a nucleus, you'll see that that DNA information, that genetic information is packaged in this part of the cell called your nucleus, right? Remember, this information is super important and we don't want anything to happen to it. So there's several protections in order to make sure that the DNA is safe. We have our nucleus, which has like a surrounding area to protect it. And then we have the outside of the cell, which is the cell membrane, and that also protects all the other components in our cells. And so when cells make more of themselves, what you have is that the DNA is making more of itself. This DNA is made in nucleotides, or we call them letters. I like to think of it as the letters of the alphabet, right? So if you read the letters of the alphabet from A to Z, they don't mean anything. If you rearrange those letters in a specific order, you can come up with words, sentences, a chapter, you can tell a story. So these 4 letters are the alphabet of DNA. These 4 letters in a string of combination can give us chapters of books that can tell us about ourselves, like genes, which will lead to the characteristics that lend to us because of proteins. Now, what happens is that we can't get the functionality in our bodies straight from this information. There's steps that have to occur in order to get the functional components in our body. So I think of things like insulin, I think of things like melanin, anything that plays a role or function in your body starts with DNA, but it has to go to another step to get to that final product. And so that step is what we call transcription. And so that turns your DNA molecule into, I guess, the buzzword now, which is RNA, or the mature form, which is messenger RNA. And so what happens is that in your cells, you're making more DNA, but that process to get from DNA to RNA happens in your nucleus. And then it comes out of your nucleus into the space of the cell that we call the cytoplasm, or the jelly of the cell. Right now, in this jelly of the cell, this is a very simplified figure, but there are a bunch of different machinery that helps to make all the processes of the cell function. And so you have your RNA, which is like the secondary molecule. It's a single string of letters, very similar to the letters of DNA, but instead of a T in their alphabet, because thinking like Spanish to English, we instead have a U, right? So these same letters mean something. And now we're halfway there to getting the functional components of our bodies, which is through a process called translation to get what we know as proteins. And so we think of proteins as these things that are doing all the work in our cells and all the work in our body. So once that RNA gets into your cell, or that mature or messenger RNA gets into your cell, your body knows to take that message to now make it into like the actual book, right? The book that we know has the information or is doing the good work. And so that protein is made into its component in the same cytoplasm. And it's comprised of, their letters are what we call amino acids. And so they're just like these little molecules that make the protein do what it does. So these proteins have different, I guess, functionalities in terms that the different letters that we have or amino acids can tell the cells where to take it or what function it needs to do, right? So there's a process. DNA makes us who we are, but in order to get to who we are, we have to go through this process. And the RNA is the middle ground from getting from that initial DNA to the thing that's doing the functions in your body, the protein. Now, viruses are very similar-ish, right? We consider them non-living because unlike our cells, we have all the machinery we need to get from DNA to RNA to protein. Viruses have similar components, but they don't have the machinery it needs to make all of those things. And so here is a virus, this specifically is coronavirus. And a virus is pretty much just a particle, like a shell with genetic information on the inside. Now, a virus can have either RNA or DNA. In the case of coronavirus, its genetic information of what makes it who it is an RNA. They don't have DNA. Now, there are some viruses that have DNA as their genetic information, and it has to go through the RNA and then the protein. All right, so we have RNA in the coronavirus. We have this lipid or fat layer protecting the RNA. Remember, our genetic information is important. If the RNA is damaged, the virus can't hijack the cells to make more of itself. And then we have these proteins, so the things that do a lot of the work, called spike proteins, and I'll talk a little bit more of the importance of this protein. So we have the RNA, DNA, very similar to the process of the body, but the virus needs to get into our cells so that next step can take place for it, where it can get to the mature RNA or the messenger RNA. It hijacks all the materials in your body or your cells again and allow that mRNA to turn into those proteins. And we know that one of the important proteins on the coronavirus is that spike protein, right? So every organism has this step in the way to make more of itself and a way to function in a way that makes it what it is. All right, so when we think about COVID infection, we think about this virus getting into our body, it's penetrating the physical barrier, so we know that it's spread through aerosols. So if the aerosol with the virus gets into your body and you swallow it, the virus can then bind proteins on your cells, so we call these receptors, and enter into your cells to hijack that process to make more of itself. And so we have the virus with their proteins, they have their genetic information, they don't have all the extra tools, so they have adopted themselves to say, hey, I know that human cell has all the tools I need, I have to infect it, I have to get all their machinery to make more of them or more of myself. So once that virus binds, so that spike protein is very important also for binding, but it's very important in terms of your body recognizing it and mounting an immune response or those antibodies that I talked about to remember it the next time it comes around. So once it binds, it enters into the cell, it makes more of itself, your body realizes this thing is foreign, it makes these antibodies, and this is like why you get sick, right? You have all these cells running to this point, but you also have this virus entering your cells and hijacking things that should normally happen into things that don't usually happen. And so what you find is that you get infected with coronavirus, your body mounts an immune response, so it produces all these antibodies. And so now your body recognizes it, or your body sees that this thing is there. It tries its hardest to make a lot more of these antibodies to try to bind the virus so that it can get rid of it, so it doesn't infect more of your cells. And so this is why it takes people a few weeks to recover, because this process takes a while. It takes a while for your body to recognize that something's there. It takes a while for the innate immune response to talk to the adaptive immune response and these antibodies to come into play. So we actually use this whole system. So people study this for years. We have to understand, one, what is the virus? What does it use? Why does it think it's important? Two, how does your immune system respond to it? And how can we combat or trick your body to get rid of it before you get infected, right? And so this is where the thought of vaccinations come into play. And so the definition of a vaccine is any substance that can stimulate your immune response to produce immunity to a specific disease. So when we talk about immunity, we're talking about those antibodies. And we also want to do it in order to protect the person from that disease. And so I think about it as you're tricking your body to say, hey, this is the thing you should fight, but we don't want that person to get sick. We just want you to mount that immune response. We just want you to make the antibodies so that they know that it's coming, right? When they see it enter, when it's breached the Capitol, they're set and they're ready to go to get rid of this virus. And so usually you get the vaccine through injection. There are some vaccines that they give through your mouth or your nose. I know my son had one in his mouth the other day, and I honestly can't remember which vaccine it was, but they do also have like the flu naze. So like the flu vaccine, there's one that they can just spray in your nose. So there are different methods of introducing the vaccines, but they all have the same idea. All right, so scientists know what the virus looks like, right? We've studied it. This virus actually evolved from other viruses that caused pandemics back in the day. So like there's a SARS outbreak, there was like the MERS outbreak. So they're very similar. Also, coronaviruses have been around for as long as scientists can remember or know about. So with things like the common cold, there are types of coronaviruses, and they all have basic functions. They all have the RNA. They all have something protecting that RNA, and they all have some type of protein that they need to enter our cells. And so scientists know that this protein is not just important for infecting, but for your body to recognize it. And so what scientists are thinking about is how can we use some part of this virus, and how can we trick your body to think that it has the virus so that we can produce antibodies specific to that infection. Now, once we can trick your body to do so, we know that if you do get infected, they're there and ready to go and get rid of that infection. Now, so we have a lot of scientific articles that come out, and they're usually out in ways that experts in that field can understand. So there's a lot of jargon, but this is from one of those papers, but it's in a well-done way. And what it did back when the pandemic was starting, people went in right away, try to figure out like, hey, this thing is happening. It reached the US, it's all over the world. How can we produce a vaccine that can combat this infection? Now, there are many different ways to make a vaccine. A lot of the vaccines that we know about are vaccines that are the killed virus, or what we call a weakened virus. So what that means is that you're taking that same virus, but you're killing it in a way that your body still recognizes all the components of it, but it cannot cause infection in your cells or in your body. And a weakened virus has the same thought. So you have this virus and you give it something to make it weak so that when you get infected, you're mounting an immune response, but you're not getting infected. Nucleic acid. So the nucleic acid is another word for genetic information. So I talked about DNA and RNA. So depending on what type of virus it is, an RNA virus like corona or a DNA virus, you can inject the body with that information so that your body can take up that information and make the protein that your immune system can recognize. They're also what we call viral vector, which just pretty much means they take another type of virus surface that doesn't make you sick to inject the genetic material of that virus so your body can mount an immune response. Or you can just give that patient or that person that specific protein, like the spike protein, in order for your body to recognize it and mount an immune response. So the thing I think with the pandemic, and we think about like how quickly this all happened, like the average vaccine before SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 took about 4 to 5 years, right? But when we think about science and how we get the funding to do this research, what happens is that you have a person that runs a lab. We know that a thing is a threat. So you say, hey, I know that, you know, over years, we might have like these mutations that occur, or we know like an outbreak is stemming, or this Ebola is an issue in this country. We think about Zika. And so they write to different foundations and say, hey, can you give me $1 million to work on making a vaccine for this thing, right? But when you come up with the laboratory stuff to make this vaccine, there are different steps that have to take place. So you have to ensure that the vaccine works like in a laboratory setting. So in cells, does it do the things that you think it does, right? Then you usually go into animals. A lot of labs use mice just to see if it gets the response that you want it to get. And then you have to recruit people to be a part of your study. And I think when we think about the pandemic, we had the funds, right? This was a worldwide effort. It wasn't like a thing that was only inflicted in one country. So we had many, many people at work. We had lots of money to work with. And we had lots of people that were willing to take part in the clinical trials, which speed up the process of this vaccine development. And so the two vaccines, and so all these vaccines, like I mentioned, pretty much goes into your cells, your immune cells pick it up, spread the word to your other cells so you can mount an immune response or produce antibodies. Now, like I mentioned, this is a worldwide effort. And so many companies and many countries are working on producing vaccines of all these different types. So the one that we're most familiar with are the ones that have authorization in the US. So we have Pfizer and BioNTech. This was actually a multinational effort. So they were organizations in Germany. We had Pfizer, which is here in US. So BioNTech is in Germany. Moderna, which is a company here in the US. And so their vaccine development was based on the RNA of the virus. But we have other countries that are working on similar types of vaccine using another method. So we have a vaccine that's currently being authorized in China, AstraZeneca in the UK, we have one in Russia. So just want to mention that there's not just one vaccine, there are many different vaccines, and it's just based on the manpower, the country, the tools that you have in order to develop that vaccine and bring it to show. The thing with RNA vaccine, though, is that it takes a lot less time to develop than some of the other methods. And so with a lot of the other methods, what you have to do is come up with the vaccine, grow it in the lab. Once you grow enough in the lab, you have to figure out a way to weaken that virus, and that might take a couple months. With the genetic material, we have technologies now. So we got the first sequence of the coronavirus in January from China. And so what we can do, there are tools that we use in the laboratory where we can put that genetic information in a machine, and the machine will spit out those letters that I talked about. And if we have those letters, we know how to synthetically make those same string of letters in order to produce the compartments or the components of the vaccine. And so we got the structure, or we got those letters or nucleotides in January, and Moderna and Pfizer went ahead and started their efforts in producing this vaccine. So exactly what is an mRNA vaccine? So hopefully I gave you a little bit of knowledge on what RNA is, or mRNA. So there are a couple of things as to why we're using mRNA vaccine. One, it cannot integrate with your genome. So I know a lot of people are worried with you injecting genetic information and it comprising with your genetic information. Like I showed you before, your DNA is enclosed in a compartment where your RNA cannot enter. It doesn't have the right messages or signals to get back into your nucleus. Right, even though it sounds new to us, mRNA vaccines, their studies actually started in the early 2000s. And so they started making mRNA vaccines for Zika. They try to make mRNA vaccines for flu. And the process of making these vaccines and putting them into practice also has to do with the money that we have and the need that we have for it. So we know that Zika kind of faded out, so the money kind of dried up. We have flu vaccines that work pretty well, so a lot of funding wasn't there to produce a new vaccine for that. But like I mentioned, it's fast and it's scalable. All you need to do is get that letter information of what that mRNA is, and you can go ahead and make that in the lab. It's rapid. We know that before COVID, that the mRNA vaccines that scientists were working on beforehand actually worked really well in preclinical trials. So they were able to already have safety and efficacy data before COVID even happened. So we know that this might be a thing for future diseases. And the other thing is that unlike the other vaccines, this one actually mounts a lower immune response, which means that you inject the mRNA into the body, your immune system recognizes it. It's like, oh, hey, we see this thing. Let's make some antibodies. Woo. Right? But then they don't make a lot of antibodies. They just make like just enough. And so what you have to do with mRNA vaccines is you have to give the body it again. Like, yo, did you see? I showed you what this wanted poster was like. Let me get you an even better image of the person you're supposed to be looking at. So it requires 2 doses. It requires the first dose and the second dose. That might be the downside for mRNA vaccine because you need people to come in twice to take their shots. So like I mentioned, the 2 vaccines that are authorized are mRNA vaccines, so Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. And so what's this vaccine? So the thing is, in order to inject, they actually worked a really long time to figure out how we can inject RNA in your body in a way that your cells or things in your body don't eat it up and get rid of it before it does what it do. And so they decided to actually enclose the RNA material into a layer of fat. So this like little tiny particles of fat that protects the RNA. Now, RNA is very sensitive, and this is why it's housed in your cells. Once it's outside of your cells, it degrades really quickly. And so you have this fat component protecting the RNA so that it's easy for it, or it has the ability now to get into your body and allow for fusion into your cells. And I'll talk about what that is in a second. And then you have the RNA in this vaccine that encodes for that spike protein on coronavirus. So remember I mentioned that the spike protein of the virus is not only important for it to get inside of your cells, but it's important for your body to recognize it and make antibodies against. And so what does this look like? So we have our vaccine, and we know the vaccine is that RNA. It's enclosed by those fat particles. You inject it into your cells. Now, what I didn't mention is that the surface of your cell is also made up of fats. And so these fats come together and they fuse, and it allows for the RNA piece to enter inside of the cell. So you're protecting it until it fuses with a cell and it gets inside of your cell. And now your cell has all the machinery. It sees the RNA. It doesn't know that this RNA doesn't belong inside. It just knows, hey, this is information I need to translate to make that functional protein. And so your cell takes up that RNA, all these machinery come together, and then it makes that spike protein. So that RNA is the message for your cells to make the protein of coronavirus, not the whole virus. So getting this vaccine won't give you the infection. It just gives your body the message to make that one protein of the virus. And that protein then, because it has signals on the protein, sends it to the surface of the cell, and all the immune cells say, hey, that thing doesn't belong here. Let's mount an immune response, or let's mount antibodies to fight that infection if it comes around again. So all you really need to do is trick your body. Say, hey, this is a virus, but not really. It's just a part of it. Your body mounts an immune response. You produce the antibodies. And so if you do come into contact with someone who has coronavirus and it enters your body, they're already in set to go to get rid of the virus. So these antibodies just bind the surface of it. And the binding of these antibodies actually prevents it from getting into your cells. So it can't cause infection. And it's very unlikely for you to spread it from to someone else because your immune response is already there. It coats it, it gets rid of it. A really neat system that scientists have developed. But I know a lot of questions is like, what exactly is in this vaccine? And I get it, right? It's like, wait, you made this thing in 9 months. You're telling me you're going to inject me with this thing. All I see is liquid. I have no idea what's in it, right? It's definitely warranted to have those discussions. And so the active ingredient, is the keyword for today is the RNA. So that RNA in the center of that lipid particle. You have salts. So we use salts a lot in labs and different things that we work on as a buffer, right? And so I don't know if you guys have heard of pH. I don't know if you guys heard like alkaline diets and things like that. So pH needs to be at a neutral pH to kind of like be able to like go into your body without causing anything crazy. And so it maintains the pH so that when it enters your body, it's not like a shock to it. And then there's lipids. So that lipid nanoparticle that I talked about that protects the RNA before it gets into your body, it's literally just another word for fats. So these like fat small molecules that is there to, this shouldn't say buffer, but it's there to protect the mRNA so that it's able to get into your body and not degrade until it fuses with your cells and the mRNA gets into your cells. And they're also sugars. So we use these sugars as a stabilizer. So we know that the vaccines have to be stored in really, really cold temperature. And that's because one, we know the mRNA is not stable. So like in most of the biomedical labs that you go into, we have rooms with different types of cold temperatures. So we have rooms that are like the temperature of your fridge. We have rooms that are the temperature of your freezer, and some that are the temperature of your deep freezer, and even colder than that. So the Moderna vaccine have to be kept in a temperature colder than your deep freezer. The Pfizer has to be kept in a temperature that's like your deep freezer. And so that just basically, the sugar is protected from the extreme cold, but the cold also protects that genetic information and the fats in order for when you thaw it out, everything is set and ready to go. It also stabilizes it. So anything that's at cold temperatures, think about like your milk lasts longer if you put it in the fridge, right? Or your bread lasts longer if you put it in the fridge. The same thing with biological material. Now, these are some of the common ingredients in other vaccines. You can find this on the CDC website, but other vaccines have things like preservatives, the same type of stuff you'll find in foods or fish, things like adjuvants. So these are just like salts. People use the scary word aluminum, but it's just a type of salt. And you can find aluminum salts in formula. You can find it in deodorant. Things like stabilizers, like I talk about in your corona vaccine. So like the sugars. So if you eat Jell-O, you've eaten this already. We know what gelatin is. We also have egg protein. So remember I told you that for the other vaccines that are not the RNA vaccines, so the vaccines where we used a weak or killed virus, we grow them in cell culture in the lab. So like the cells that I showed you in the beginning of the slide, we have actual cells that we have in dishes that we can put the virus in, because remember, we need the machinery to make more of the virus. And so the egg protein is just residual from those cell culture components. And you can find this in eggs. We also have like formaldehyde. So this is just something that they use to kill or inactivate the virus. This is not in the RNA virus. These are the traditional vaccines. And you can find some of these naturally in the body. And we also have residual antibiotics, which is also not in the coronavirus vaccine, but it does protect from contamination from bacteria through the vaccine manufacturing process, which is not a thing of concern because this is not the killed or weakened, it's just the genetic material in the coronavirus vaccine that's authorized in the US. Now, there's a lot of talk now with the mutations and variants. And I just want to preface this with saying these viruses, they're simple organisms, simple because they cause havoc, but they're simple in terms of they only have the genetic material, they have the thing that protects them, they have the proteins that allow for them to get into our cells. What happens though is that they don't have a, what do you call that, like a proofreading mechanism. So think about like writing an essay. Our cells in our bodies have mutations all the time, but we have ways to correct those mistakes. So if I switch one letter for something else, our body recognizes, our cells recognizes, hey, that letter shouldn't be there, let's fix it. For viruses, they don't have that. So every time someone gets infected and the virus makes more of themselves, it's very likely that mutations are going to arise. So if you look at some sites, I can show what the site looks like later, but I don't have it in the slide. they can show you all the mutations that have occurred in coronavirus since the start of the pandemic. There are many. The thing is, the virus is already so good at infecting your cells. Any mutation that changes the ability for it to infect the cells doesn't really pass on. It's kind of like evolution in humans, if like the survival of the fittest. And so if you have a mutation that changes the spike protein in a way that it can't bind to your cell proteins to get inside the cells, it's not going to pass on. But that doesn't mean that the virus cannot come up with a mutation that makes it better than it is right now. And so what I tell people is that if you do decide you're not going to take the vaccine, you need to be very mindful in terms of getting infected and passing that to someone else. So one of the things I hear people say is like, oh, I caught it. It wasn't that bad, right? But who did you spread it to? Remember, like every time you get infected, the virus has a chance to make a really great mutation and cause even more havoc, and we'll never get out of this pandemic. And so we're seeing the effects of that right now, right? We have 3 what we call variants. So there's still the SARS-CoV-2, which is the name of the virus, but the variants just means that this is a set of mutations that happen that actually makes the virus more unique and more dominant. So it's almost better than the one that's circulating. And yes, it's worrisome. So we know that there's one in the United Kingdom. This nomenclature is just like the way that scientists call this virus. But it was recognized in the US in December of 2020. Like I mentioned, it has a large number of mutations. So many mutations took place where it changed some of the components of the virus. And now there's studies and data that shows that this specific variant of coronavirus is well more equipped to infecting your cells. So the spike protein actually has an even better affinity or can even bind a lot better to your cells than the regular coronavirus that's currently circulating. There's another one, the South African variant was discovered in the US in January 21. It has similar mutations to the one that they isolated in the UK. And it's now detected in multiple countries. And then there's another variant of concern that came in Brazil. It's been detected in the US in the end of January. And so I think the thing is, that's why there's such a push for vaccination, because we're like running against the clock, right? These viruses, even though they seem like simple things, right? They're not even living things. Like they need us to make more of themselves, right? But if us is out there and we're the breathing ground for making more of them, then it has an opportunity to become better at what it does, which is a scary thought. So people are really pushing, if we have vaccinations happening, we can reduce the amount of new variants that are coming into play. The good news is that there was a study from Rockefeller that just came out that they looked at people's antibodies who were vaccinated with the Moderna vaccine, and they looked at antibodies from people that were vaccinated from Pfizer. They have the different variants of coronavirus. And so they looked at how well do these antibodies still bind and get rid of that infection. The bad news is that the antibodies bind, but not as well as they do for the normal coronavirus, but they still bind. So there is a decrease in binding, like the antibodies being able to bind and get rid of the virus. Which the good news is that the vaccines that we currently have works for still preventing infection with these viruses, but we know it's only a matter of time before another variant come across where that response that you have produced in your body from the vaccine may not be well equipped to get rid of the virus. Someone asked a question about adverse events to vaccines. So there are actually a couple places that you can go. There's one that's called vSafe, where once you get the vaccine, you can just go on your phone and put like the vaccine you got, the dose you got, what do you feel? So for example, well, my husband didn't do it, but he got his first shot. But one of the side effects that he had was a sore arm. Now he's been vaccinated with every vaccine under the sun because he was in the military. They don't even tell you what's in those vaccines. If you sign up for the military, you know you're getting injected. But this is just a way for the CDC and the FDA to keep track of the side effects that happens and any adverse effects that comes about. There's also the vaccine adverse event reporting system. And so they did the V-Safe so it can be easy to input with your phone. But this, you can download a form on the CDC website and you can put in any symptoms or side effects that you have. So the CDC monitors this information, the FDA monitors this information. They go through it and see like how many people are having these adverse events, how many people are having side effects. The good news is that the good news is that the side effects that do occur are very mild. So people complain about the soreness at the vaccine site. And the second dose of the vaccine, people talk about having flu-like symptoms for like a day. That's literally a sign that your immune system is doing what it's doing. So remember that video that I showed you in the beginning where all those cells are going to that site of injury? Just think of all the cells in your body just going crazy, like, we have to go fight this virus, right? And so like you get the fever, you get the chills, but it passes because then everything in your body starts to level off again. There hasn't been any known cases that they're directly able to correlate death with the vaccine. So that's good news. That's not saying that it might not happen in the future. We know the more people that get vaccinated, the more, just by chance, the more things that can happen. But one thing I like to think about is how does that compare with the actual infection itself? So this is data that I took earlier today, where it's just showing the COVID cases and the COVID deaths just in the United States. We're not even talking worldwide. So we have 27 million COVID cases and almost 500,000 deaths. To put that in perspective, where I'm from, the US Virgin Islands, all 3 islands, we have a population of 100,000 people. That's all 3 islands dying almost 5 times. And I think like when you think about, people say like, oh, it's only like a 2% rate of death. That's a lot of people. And like I mentioned, even if you don't get severely ill, you do give the breeding ground for these viruses to come up with more mutations and adapt and become even better at what they do than they're currently doing. Another thing I think about is, if we just disregard the death and think about people with what we call like ongoing symptoms. So I have friends in the medical fields and they will show you what someone's lungs look like pre and post COVID. After they've recovered, their lungs are still cloudy. They still have the fatigue. We know that some people are still having ailments even after they recover with coronavirus. And we know that the long-term effects with COVID seems to be a thing in a number of different people. And we are not seeing the same with the vaccination. Because remember, the vaccine is not giving you the virus, right? People have these additional ailments because that virus goes into your cells, it replicates. It hijacks your cell's machinery to make more of itself. It goes to your lung cells, it does the same thing, and it destroys them, right? A lot of times when you destroy these cells, it's just really hard for them to come back to normal. So if we track the vaccination so far, I know there's hesitancy, but I'm proud to say that I've seen many people taking the vaccine. I've been trying to find a slot to take the vaccine. New York City ran out of first doses. Hopefully at some point we have those available. But even though there's hesitancy, people are running to get the vaccine, I think because they see what this has done to their family members or their friends. I know of a handful of people who've passed away from COVID, just having people in the field, just hearing their stories, people who've been exposed with coronavirus. The stories are endless. But as of now, there've been 34 million doses administered. 27 million people have already gotten the first dose. This is just in the US. And 9 million people in the US received both doses. What we are seeing too, which shows that the vaccine is working, is that we're seeing the rates now finally starting to decrease, right? The hospitalizations are now starting to decrease. We're only at like 2% of the US population vaccinated, but that just gives us hope that, the more vaccinations we have, as quickly as we can do it before some monster coronavirus comes about, I think the quicker we'll get out of this pandemic. And so I gave a lot of scientific background because I think, especially when there's a lot of misinformation, you hear these fancy words and they throw these terms at you and it sounds super scary. trust me, anything that's new, anything that's foreign is scary. A thing that I tell my students is, hey, do you know about dihydrogen monoxide? Do you know the government is giving people that? And everybody's like, what? We know it. You know, the government ain't, you know, they ain't doing anything that's supposed to be done. Or they're trying to kill everyone. And I'm like, oh, but do you know what dihydrogen monoxide is, right? Dihydrogen monoxide is H2O. It's water, right? But because we use another terminology, it sounds like a chemical, it sounds scary, so people get frantic. And so I would really watch for, you know, seeing information and trying to recognize it for what it is. Just because you see a lot of terminology that sounds scary, a lot of times it may not be like that. Make sure you get your information from validated sources. I know a lot of people don't trust the government, but there are a lot of different websites, and I think I have a slide with that I trust to give good information. Be aware of misinformation. If it's something that sounds far-fetched, it's probably not true. I think one thing is frustrating for people outside of science is that you're seeing what people encounter in the lab over years in real time really quickly. Like in the lab, we're so used of like things not working, having to get data, the data changes. We only know as much as we have. And so people get tired of saying, oh, we don't know yet. We don't have the data. Well, what do you know, right? But like, we just can't say something it is what it is if we don't have the data to back it. That's just what it is. So if you're seeing information that says this is it and there's nothing else, that's a sign that it's probably in misinformation. If it says that I don't care what no one sells, this is a thing to make sure that the entire populations die off, that seems a little far-fetched, right? See where that information is coming from. Like I mentioned, things that are new and sounds complicated might seem scary. Remembering that science is a reliable field and it does give you reliable information, but it is also tentative. And I think this current pandemic has showcased that to the general public is like, what you told me 2 months ago that, you know, this virus could only be passed on if I just sneezed on someone. Now you telling me that if someone breathed next to me, I might catch the virus, right? And it's frustrating to hear this information changing all the time, but that's how it works, right? When you're in a laboratory and you're doing this stuff, you have these hypotheses, you have the data. As you do more experiments, as you understand what other people are doing, like I said, like with this vaccine development, it's a worldwide effort. What is really nice is that it's reliable in terms of Moderna can give their information to a whole nother company in Jerusalem, and they should be able to come up with the exact data set that Moderna gave. It's reliable information, right? But if there's a new technology that can allow us to make something even better, that doesn't mean the Moderna vaccine was wrong. It just means that we came up with something that's different that can do an even better job at doing it. So reliable and tentative. There's always more to learn. I think that even I have learned so much in this past year, in all my years in a lab working, right? So every day there's new information, there's new therapies, there's new vaccine. So don't be scared of the new information. I think sometimes it's overwhelming because you see it out there all the time. You don't know what to believe. But I think just taking bits and pieces, you know, being open to understanding the process. Don't go by hearsay. Even the scientific information, I double check, right? So if someone of my friends tell me this, I'm like, all right, give me a second. Let me do a quick search and let me see if that's right. My husband would tell me something and he'd be like, why you always have to double check what I say? I was like, I don't know. I just need to make sure you're giving me the right information, right? So just always double check in and ensuring that the information you have is the right information. So yeah, like I mentioned, some great resources. The CDC website has some really nice graphics. The FDA, I know people are like, we don't really trust them. But there are like other news sources that I really love. The NPR, which I feel like is a pretty good, like nonpartisan news site. There are some other ones that I didn't put on here, but like New York Times, which has a paywall, but all the COVID information is free. The Atlantic is a really good news source to get your information from. Scientific American, I think it does a decent job of trying to break down the jargon in a way that's understandable. I do have some previous colleagues and classmates that have come up with places to get good, reliable information, and I trust their information. So Unbiased Science Podcast, I think they're on Facebook, maybe Instagram. Local Epidemiologist is also on Facebook. If you go to some of the university websites, they have like all of like the news sources. So if you go to like rockefeller.edu, you'll see what scientists are working on in terms of COVID. And of course, follow me on Instagram, Dr_Odealys. I've started this Instagram page because I just know there's a lot of hesitancy in our community. Being a Black woman, a Christian, a scientist, I think like, you know, getting your information as someone that can resonate with your experiences is super important. I try my best to break down the information in something that's short and sweet and straight to the point. I am behind on posting because I also have my job that I get paid for to do, and I need to make sure that's being done. So yeah, that's it. I am open to answering any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We want to thank Dr. Odealys Walwyn Pollard for giving us all this information. I felt like I was in science class all over again, and
hopefully a good science class.
I think it's great information just because like in our community, you know, there's so much things that's going on and we don't know. So thank you for giving us that detailed presentation. It was fantastic. I know there were some questions. If you have any questions, please drop it in the chat box, or we'll give you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask a question. But we did have some questions come in, and I think that she covered most of them in her presentation. I'm looking at it right now. I don't know if you answered it. If you have a choice, would you take the vaccine and why?
Oh yeah, definitely. So like I said, my husband got his first shot. So he's a train operator. And in the earlier the pandemic, they actually had one of the highest positivity COVID rates. Like every day he came home, he's like, another coworker got COVID. You know, this other train operator that I worked with passed away from COVID. And so it was a scary time. And as soon as the vaccine came out and he was like on there. Even now he's on there still trying to get appointments for his aunts, his uncles, myself. We got an appointment for his grandmother. She's in her late 80s. She got her first shot. She's getting her second one sometime this week. His grandfather in his late 80s too, who actually just finished chemotherapy treatment. His doctor also recommended him getting the vaccine. He had the vaccine, no adverse events. Like I said, I'm kind of on the list. It states that teachers and educators can get their shots, but like I said, they don't have any first doses available in New York. But I'm definitely getting the vaccine. As to which vaccine I'll get, at this point, whatever is available. I know in New York City sites, I think, got Moderna vaccines, and New York State sites got Pfizer. They're both very similar. The main difference is that the Pfizer, you get your second dose 3 weeks after your first dose. And it's stored in not as cold temperatures as the Moderna. The Moderna vaccine is 4 weeks after your first dose, and it has to be, Pfizer is colder than Moderna. Moderna has slightly higher temperatures stored at. But they use the same technology. Can you talk
a little bit about the temperature storage? Because that was actually a question. So what's the difference between the external and internal temperature?
So the internal temperature is like 98.6, 37 degrees. What they don't inject it in you super cold. So what they have to do, and this is like an actual thing that's happening in terms of not wasting vaccines. So the companies send you a vial with a certain number of vaccine administration amount in it. And so you have to take it out of the freezer. You have to thaw it to room temperature. So I think 70 something degrees. And so you can only keep it out for a certain amount of time. So what happens if they don't use all of the amount in that vial, they have to throw it out because, like I mentioned, the RNA is unstable at warmer temperatures. And it took them a really long time to figure out how we can get this RNA in a stable enough form. So that's the way they covered in that, circle fat layer in order for it to get to your cells, and your cells can make the protein out of it. So and this is also a good thing in terms of, when we think of long-term effects, like scientifically, the mRNA is not staying around. It's quickly being taken up and made into the protein, right? And the protein isn't staying around. It stays around for about a day or so, but just long enough to give your body a signal to say, hey, make these antibodies. So the temperatures are more so for storage. They thaw it. Once it gets into your body, that fat layer protects it until it fuses into your cells. Your cells have the machinery to make the protein. That protein send a signal, and then that protein degrades.
Okay. I saw a question in the chat. Are there any disease process that can damage your mRNA?
Is there any disease process that can damage your? Not that I know of. Yeah, I think like the DNA mRNA protein is such a fine-tuned machine, unless you have some type of genetic component where like you're missing letters in a certain gene, you'll develop a different RNA, which you'll develop a different protein. And that's what we see with a lot of genetic ailments. But there's no diseases that can like really mess up your RNA information.
Okay. I saw a question of vaccines normally take years of observations to be able to safe. So how are we sure that 8 to 9 months after this vaccine, if we take it, that there won't be any severe reactions down the road? So I know you mentioned like we might get our arms sore, and that's like, I think when I was little, I used to hate getting shot. My arm was already skinny, and then it would, then it's like, I feel like I'm being punched in my arm. Yeah. Shot. So besides those, how can we trust science that nothing extreme may happen?
Yeah, so it's just basically we know as much as the data tells us. So in the clinical trials, so it's funny because I hear a lot of people say like, oh, I don't want to be the guinea pig. There are already like 70,000. There are 70,000 guinea pigs in the clinical trials, right? So there were people that already like said, hey, we want to help. And so this is what we call there are 3 phases in authorizing or approving any drug or vaccine. And so the first phase is to see if it mounts our immune response, like is it effective? And the second phase, I think if it's safe, or it might be the other way around. So you look at safety, efficacy, and then you take those 2 and you just bring in a larger group of people. So you might start with 20 people, and then your phase 3 is thousands of people. So Moderna and Pfizer had over 100,000 people that took part in the study. And so what they did, half of them, they gave them like a fake vaccine. So not the actual components of the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine. And another half, they gave them the actual components of the vaccine. And so basically what they did is that they check in with them over time and see who got COVID and who didn't get COVID. But not only that, they took blood samples and say, hey, did you have the antibodies? There are tools in the lab that we can use. If you take your blood, you can see how much antibodies that person has produced from the vaccine, and if it's specific to the actual virus.
Okay. Someone asked if you've already had the virus, when is the best time to get the vaccine if you've already gotten coronavirus? Because I know there's a lot of people who've already been infected with the virus. So when will be the best time for them to get it?
Anytime after you recovered. So they suggest that you don't take it if you're currently infected. They say infection or the virus usually lasts around 2 weeks in your body. I would say your natural immunity would give you a couple months of being protected. There are studies also done at Rockefeller where they show that natural immunity, so people who have immune response because they've actually been infected with the virus, it actually wanes after a certain amount of time. So the amount of antibodies you produce and the effectiveness of the antibodies decrease over time. And I think the data is showing anywhere from 6 to 8 months, you have pretty good protection. And so even if you try to sign up for the vaccine, one of the questions they'll ask is if you had COVID, and you'll just be on the bottom of the list. So I think people are looking for like people that are compromised or like working people facing jobs.
Does this vaccine alter your DNA at all? We have a question. Does it? No? Okay.
No, so those are like the pictures that I showed you where your cells, your DNA and your RNA are in 2 completely different components of your cells. So once that RNA get into like the jelly of your cell, your DNA is hidden in another compartment, so they never meet. And so if that was possible, we could have done some crazy science experiments, but we can't. Thinking about like genetic mutations of like humans, but it's just not possible. RNA doesn't have signals that can tell it to go back into your nucleus, and your nucleus has a protective layer where your RNA just cannot penetrate. Things come out of the nucleus like your RNA, but the RNA can never go back in.
Okay. Someone asked, are there any medications that are contraindicated with the vaccine, such as immunotherapy or chemotherapy?
Yeah, so as of now, I haven't seen anything saying that. There are actually recommending people who are undergoing chemotherapy and immunotherapy to take the vaccine because they know that the effects of being infected with the actual virus was way more risky than getting the vaccine. They have people who've been vaccinated, and I haven't heard of any like ill effects with the vaccine and those drugs.
Okay. I saw this question. I don't know if you answered this. Are there any contraindications concerning medications that may cause an allergic reaction if the vaccine is taken?
Yeah, so they usually suggest if you have any allergic reaction that cause like anaphylaxis, so like really bad allergic reactions where you can't breathe, they suggest that you wait to take the vaccine, or if you do take the vaccine, what they do is they keep you around for about 30 minutes just to see if anything happens. If you do have an adverse reaction, they have the epinephrine, so they can do that right away, and they have like nursing staff and doctors to take care of it. But if you do have like severe allergic reactions to like, I don't know, salts or sugars or certain foods, they do recommend that maybe you wait. And if you do get the vaccine, you have to stay around for a certain amount of time to get that. There was some data that came out in December where they looked at anaphylaxis, so like really serious allergic response. And I think it was like 0.01% of the people that took it, and they were all like, they weren't like anything long-term. It was something that happened. They gave them the epinephrine and they were fine.
Someone said some people have been recommended not to take Tylenol or Motrin after getting the vaccine to help with muscle soreness or chills. They said it dampens the immune response. Is that true?
I haven't heard of that. I actually hear the opposite. So we actually do recommend taking Tylenol after, not before, after the vaccine. It doesn't dampen your response. It kind of just like, what do you call that? Just stop the pain from happening. It just like mask the pain.
Yeah. I think those are all of our questions. So my question is, so how, with the rate of how vaccinations are going, how long do you think we're going to actually be in this pandemic?
Questions that need answers.
That's my question. It's just like, with people, just seeing with the rate of how people are getting vaccinated, like how long do you foresee this going on?
So
normal is what everyone wants to know.
If we're doing it at the rate we are doing it now, there was a article that I saw in a study that said it would take 11 months for 75% of the population to get vaccinated to get what we call herd immunity. So like we stop the spread of infection. So that means going into 2022. But it's also, I think the reason why, sadly, the US has actually done the worst in terms of controlling the pandemic. If we look at countries like Australia or New Zealand, they have done really great in like curbing the infection. I think they just found one case of coronavirus. Like they were back to normal. Like people were partying, there were no masks.
Yeah.
And one person like came in and now they're like on strict shutdown. I think the problem with the US is that every state is under their own jurisdiction, right? We don't have any like standard laws. Everyone's on different sides of the playing field. People are like, you can't tell me not to wear a mask, or you can't tell me to get back. There are other countries like, you don't have a say, right? And, unfortunately, that has hindered our progress, right? Where these countries are like, no, this is what's happening. You're not leaving. You have to get tested. You have to wear your mask. You have to quarantine. And people is who spread the infection, right? If we still go about our daily lives that we're not in a pandemic and people still refuse to take the vaccine, we can be in this for, I don't know. I'm really hoping by the end of the year, we're back to semi-normal, but Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think those are all of the questions. Pastor, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we close out?
You're muted. The mute button.
Just want to show our deep appreciation to Dr. Walwyn Pollard for the exceptional presentation. We saw and felt the need for us to gather the information, and I believe she shared some relatively great information with us this evening so that you're able to make a prayerful and educated decision. Don't listen to the soothsayers. Don't listen to people share their experiences, because sometimes their experience may not be yours. Do your own research, gather the necessary information, talk to your primary care doctor, be prayerful, and then after you've done that, you're able to make educated decision whether or not you should take the vaccine or not. Those who might have joined us late, you have the opportunity to go back and look at this on our website at lifestylehouston.org, on Facebook, at our Facebook page. You can also look at this on YouTube, and you can also look at this on Zoom as well. So you have the opportunity to go back and look at this from the beginning. If there are no more questions or comments, we want to thank Dr. Pollard and thank my beautiful daughter, Melissa, for co-host. And then we're just going to pray. Amen. We're just going to pray for each and every one that's on this call tonight, that the Lord would really lead and guide. So Dr. Pollard, once again, thank you for an exceptional presentation. Let's give her a hand. Let's give her a hand. Exceptional presentation. Let us pray. Father God, we bow in your presence and we thank you. Your word says if we lack wisdom, we should ask. So God, tonight we ask for wisdom. We have seen close to 70 persons come in and out of this Zoom call on Facebook, on YouTube, on Boxcast, that have joined us this evening for information. And we pray, God, that them joining us will lead to them making a decision as it relates to the COVID-19 vaccine. We pray, dear God, that you would remove fear. And Lord, they would allow your wisdom to guide them, God, not to lean to their own understanding, but in all their ways, they will acknowledge you and you will direct their path. We pray your blessing upon the presenter tonight. We pray your blessing upon her son, upon her husband. And we thank you for her, God. We pray that you'll continue to bless her. And everyone that's on this prayer line, we pray your blessing and protection upon each and every one of them. And we give you praise and glory and honor. And we say thank you in Jesus' name. Amen and amen. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. God bless you all.